in establishing the first annual Perkins and Will Visiting Scholar at Tuskegee University. With that, Kevin Holland, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Will. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us in our fifth session. They've been very highly and well attended in the past, and so thank you for agreeing to participate with us this morning. We're going to be discussing open space and parks, and we have a stellar panel with us this morning. Sarah Carr, who is an assistant professor from Northeastern University, Matthew Clarke, who is the executive director of Design Trust for Public Space, Mia Lehrer, who is president of Studio MLA, Alma Du Solier, studio director with Hood Design Studio, and Nate Cormier, studio director with Rios. I will now turn everything over to the panel. Sarah, beginning with you, if you wouldn't mind giving a few words of introduction.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Will and Kevin, for having me today, and thanks to my fellow panelists. My name is Sarah Carr. I'm an assistant professor at the Northeastern University School of Architecture in Boston, which I'm calling in from today. And I'm an architect and landscape architect, but my focus of study is on the built environment, specifically urban landscape and health. And I have a book coming out early next year called The Topography of Wellness, that looks at the history of different epidemics in the United States and their impact on urban landscape.
Thank you, Sarah. Matthew.
Hi, everyone. I'm Matthew Clarke, the executive director of the Design Trust for Public Space, based in New York. We've been around for 25 years, leading the public space movement here nationally, and we believe in public space as a key and critical piece of infrastructure for cities and communities across the country. It's really nice to be amongst you all today.
Thank you, Matthew. Nate.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nate Cormier. I help lead the landscape practice at Rios. Rios is a transdisciplinary design collective. We're located in the Leimert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. And our landscape studio is about 45 designers with very diverse backgrounds. And we're currently working on public open space all around Southern California, as well as San Francisco, Denver, Houston, Austin, and Tulsa. And today's my birthday, and I couldn't be happier than spending it with you guys talking about parks. So looking forward to it.
All right, happy birthday, Nate. Alma.
Hi, everybody. My name is Alma Du Solier. I'm a landscape architect. I'm also an architect in my previous life, but I'm originally from Mexico. I moved to Northern California to go to Berkeley, yikes, more than 20 years ago, and I never left. And currently I am the director of a design studio, which is in Oakland, California. It's a small practice. There's 12 of us, and we call ourselves a social practice because what we do is kind of navigate between landscape architecture and public art and urban design and everything kind of in between, trying to blur those lines. And a lot of our work focuses on communities that typically are underserved. We do some other projects in other communities, not all of them are underserved, but there's a lot of our focus is on trying to figure out how open space can be a unifier in a lot of the sort of social topics that affect us daily. So very happy to be here today. It's definitely a crazy change in time, so I'm looking forward for the conversation.
All righty, thank you, Alma. And Mia.
Good morning. We here are a team of urbanists and landscape architects. We advocate through design. We create spaces and places that derive meaning through community inclusion in the process of building them. I am a Latina, like Alma. I arrived a little later than she did, but earlier, 40 years ago, to LA. This city is rich with issues of our time: densification, inequality, homelessness, and climate change. So I really think that our training in landscape architecture provides an opportunity to derive change. Parks, housing, civic and educational facilities, rivers and streams, botanical gardens, and college campuses. That's the kind of work we do. we also do ballparks. So we are pleased to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
All righty, thank you, Alma. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about public space in a systematic, logical order, if possible. But of course, with discussions, we may sort of touch on topics that are unexpected. But in order, we're going to talk about what is public space, the role of public space. There is a distinction. The challenges, and then the future of public space. So I'm going to tee it up, and I'm going to throw out that first question: what is public space? And if any one of the panelists would like to start with it, and we'll spend about 10 to 12 minutes on each, and then we'll transition into the next topic, and then ending up with question and answer. Would someone like to start with that in their opinion, in their impression? What is public space?
So I'll start. I think public space is the public realm, whether it's intentional or unintentional, fluid, whether attained for us or whether it's in its wild state, raw wild state. It's part of the morphology of a city with plazas, parks, local, regional streets, sidewalks, and bus stops, public infrastructure. And in the unbuilt, the wild outdoors, which is also extremely important, but also has to be accessible, which is part of an issue in a big city like ours. And who is it for? It should be for everyone, and it should not be a luxury. It's a critical public health infrastructure, and it's essential common resource for all citizens alike, and should be taken into consideration as we move forward. Space becomes place with the addition of people's experiences and narratives. We need to be inclusive of people whose narratives will unfold in these spaces. So that's what I think public space is.
Yeah, I can chime in. I absolutely agree with everything Mia just said. It was interesting at the start of the pandemic, I was asked by an interviewer about how public space would be affected by the pandemic. And as a landscape architect and architect, and actually I got into landscape architecture because I was interested in the space between the buildings I was working on. So they asked me about how the pandemic would affect public space. And I was thinking about squares and plazas and parks. And I didn't realize until about halfway the interview that they were thinking of public spaces like movie theaters or shopping malls. So maybe it speaks to, as a profession, how we view public space differently, but I absolutely second everything Mia just said, that as Jan Gehl famously said, it's the life between buildings, and ideally it should be accessible and open to everybody. And I'm sure we'll get into it later, but hopefully this is something we're examining more carefully post-pandemic, but also in our age of re-examining social justice as we are now.
Okay. I think this is Alma. I was just going to add that one of the things that Mia mentioned that I think is extremely becoming, I think, more important now and within the context of the pandemic, but even before that, I believe in the context of social justice, is the idea that open space is also the unplanned. And a lot of these, particularly in our large cities, those become areas that tend to be related to infrastructure that for many years or forever, particularly in the US, because it's a little different in other countries, but in the US, there's some sacredness to not getting the public close to some of these larger infrastructure. I'm talking about, underpasses and freeways and other areas that we have access to, but there's a lot of limitation of what can happen there. And by default, they become these spaces that are seen as a detriment to our experience in the city. And what I think is interesting in this day and age, when we start defining what public space is now, it's interesting that public space is now kind of the safer area to meet with friends and everybody, and not friends. I mean, it's a place where we can maintain a bit more distance. And one of the sort of constraints I've always thought that this other open spaces, this public open spaces that are more connected to infrastructure, have been excluded from being officially an open space for public that could become a place, as Mia was defining it, is because the authority's perception that that's an unsafe location for people. And now I'm thinking, maybe we are starting to redefine what safe means in the context of, like, right now we need just more breathing room. And maybe we can begin to rethink how some of those spaces that have been completely out of the conversation, again, because they present some other health challenges and some other perception challenges of safety, and see what that brings us. And we should definitely be very opportunistic about that in this context, which this conversation wouldn't be under these parameters, having the pandemic not be present. So I just challenged the panel to, maybe we can, I would love to hear your ideas and your thoughts about that.
I think the most visible example of what Alma, you were just describing, is the role the role of streets has changed. It's something that was already underway, but it was more experimental, or we would say tactical urbanism or parklets, and they were seen as these small tests of ideas of occupation more for people instead of cars. And with COVID, that tendency is just accelerated, and we're seeing various forms of open streets, outdoor dining taking over parking spaces, et cetera, all over the country, all over the world. People painting whole streets blue to say this is not a car place. And so I think that's like this, hopefully, people talk about the genie's out of the bottle, that like, we're not going to go back to working the way we used to work. A lot of us are probably wearing shorts or our pajama bottoms. And I think the way we use public space, likewise, it won't go back in the bottle. There'll be things we appreciate, silver linings to what we're going through in this crisis that we want to hang on to or build upon when it's over.
I can only amplify what's been said earlier. I think this, first of all, expansive definition of what public space is and how it serves. And I would almost actually restate that question a little bit as not only what is public space, but who defines what public space is. To me, this is the critical question of this year, but it's been an acute question for many years, actually. What communities define what public space and how it serves them, how our public leadership is defining public space in an expansive way. For example, I was speaking with the New York City Park Commissioner, Mitchell Silver, who I'm sure many of you know, yesterday. And you know what he's passionate about right now? Nate, to your point, he cares about streets, which is actually kind of amazing to think about, that a parks commissioner who has kind of a bureaucratic domain that is very defined actually cares about streets and is working with, DOT to think about what that public realm is. Or I'm using another New York example, apologies to LA, but the health department here has been investing in public space for years now, and that's not been talked about. And they're doing so with community, and we'll get to this a little bit later, I think, but that matters in terms of who is defining and who has a stake in public space. To me, that's the critical question, because I think we're realizing more and more, to Mia's point, that it is that critical infrastructure. It's one of those essential human rights that we all need.
Does anyone else have an opinion on who defines public space? Who should, rather?
Who should? Well, I think it's in most of the big cities, at least, I think that many of the infrastructural agencies have a lot to do with, how do you use those spaces? Do you have access to them? And how do you improve them? Whether it's the County Flood Control District in Los Angeles or LA County, or the Army Corps of Engineers, those are all agencies now that kind of define, can you access or can't you access? What can you do there? And it's I think there is at least I would say in the LA area, many of the leaders of those agencies are very forward thinking. They do communicate across the country with the agencies that address water and water issues. And I think there's a breakthrough happening where, for example, they're studying not just rivers, but streams, miles and miles of streams, and looking at streams as opportunities to connect communities and to address water in in a more sort of, rather than just tactically, but really in a, creating a sponge city becomes like, okay, yeah, we're going to do a sponge. It's going to be sponges all over. And now we have all sorts of funding from measures which are associated with property taxes to actually do multi-benefit solutions. So you're not, I mean, at least in our county, you have the right people at the table, and you just got to light the, I don't want to say light the fire, but right, somehow engage them in this quest to, the planning is done, people understand how to solve the problems, and you just got to do. And so I guess the question is, where's the funding and who pulls the trigger?
But Mia, don't you think that I agree with what you just said, but don't you think that going back to who defines what open space is, maybe this notion of what is safe for the public is something that we have. I'm not saying that all the infrastructure should be available to everybody and we just kind of walk around everywhere we want to, but there is a definition of what is safe for the sort of welfare of public that sometimes, in my experience, prevents certain potential access. And all those agencies, the Army Corps, et cetera, I mean, talking about, the LA River, and I'm not an expert in that, you are, but I think there is a lot of challenges to getting in some of those areas just because it's perceived as public safety. And I know that is true, but also can we begin to redefine how that works? And how do we, allow people to take more risks, let's say, in a sense, to be able to gain more access to amenities or elements that are currently completely underused. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think it's already happening. Like I said, they've finished a lot of planning efforts, and now it's a matter of effectuating some of them. So whereas in the past, any narrow spaces along sort of parts of the city next to channels, water channels, were just deemed as, just stormwater, it's just a stormwater system. Now it's much more than that. And I think those barriers have been broken, and now it's just a matter of doing them equitably across the city, because a lot of these experiments happen in areas that are easier to sort of implement, and we need to start thinking about other parts of the city that haven't, where some of these improvements haven't been happening.
Okay, when this group met last week, we talked about our agenda and the question of what the role of public space is, and I think I sent it with a line, fill in the blank. What is the role of public space in, and it could be a number of things, in health, in quality of life? What is the role of public space in social justice? And you can take any one of those and unpack them.
So having completed the book sort of on the role of the public realm in health specifically, I can take that question on first as a springboard. A public space, I would say, especially green space, not to define it as actually green too much, but has been very key in ensuring urban health over the decades. And we look back at Frederick Law Olmsted, the father of landscape architecture, and also Daniel Burnham. And Olmsted was actually trained in public health. He was a sanitary officer, and he parlayed that experience into building a lot of the canonical parks, at least on the East Coast, we know today. And he advocated for their building using public health evidence at the time, which was mostly anecdotal. So he talked about, the need for large parks to keep the air fresh, because this was just after the Industrial Revolution where our skies were very polluted. But he also talked about the importance of having parks in the city, and this was aimed at urban dwellers who couldn't escape the city to go to their country homes and nature resorts, which might resonate with the current health crisis we're in today. But that urban dwellers needed a green space to escape the city, and as he said, sort of rest their nervous conditions or get away from the kind of busyness of the city. And I think what's fascinating about that is 100 years later, as we have more and more empirical tools to say, measure measure brain waves, right, and measure levels of pollution in the air, and to quantify how much stormwater parks can pick up, and even lower blood pressure, right, and lower stress by testing saliva. We have all these empirical methods that actually prove that public spaces and parks are very essential to public health in a very direct way. And again, I think we're only seeing that more during this pandemic, where being out in open space is one of the few safe activities we can engage in. On the flip side, what we're seeing is that those public spaces and those green spaces are not equitably distributed, right? And in a lot of neighborhoods, we're seeing an intersection between populations, Black and Brown communities, that are being triply hit, whether it's through climate change and living in hotter neighborhoods, that are more affected by the pandemic, that are more affected by social injustice. And I hope something we can think about in the future is how, sort of all three of these issues can be addressed by equitably planned public space that's done, in conjunction with the communities that they're placed in.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Sarah.
I want to, if I could have one point be emphasized, it'd be this: the connection between public health and something I've been thinking a lot about recently. And if you had a bucket of dollars to invest in health equity, what would you do? And ultimately, if you're trying to address chronic disease and you're addressing that, you're actually too late. Because as we know now with the social determinants of health, that our health outcomes are only 20% determined by access to healthcare and our health choices. The balance of that is our physical environment, our social connections, our opportunity for economic, for jobs. And so we know, as Sarah was saying, that just having a connection, just being next to a park, next to a tree, lowers your heart rate, has real physiological changes on our bodies. And so we recognize that, and I think that's become more and more common. But I think there's even one more level, and Sarah also got to this in terms of justice, that just having that access is even still not enough. And that there are health departments around the country recognizing that it is structural drivers, that who shapes those assets, who shapes transportation infrastructure, who shapes parks, that's actually the health issue, right? And so racism is a public health issue. And so you're seeing that in a very sophisticated way about in our public health infrastructure. And why that's important is because parks are a prime way to address that by investing in friends of group, engaged and empowered communities, voter outreach, connectivity amongst organizations, building power, because ultimately that's how you address those downstream health benefits. So parks and public space are like this all-powerful kind of like superfood. They both provide this direct connection to health, but they also promote, that long-term structural change that can make our communities more equitable.
Yeah, just to add on to that quickly, I think we'll probably talk about maintenance and the future of public parks in the future, but I think it's really fascinating that, a few years ago, Kaiser Permanente, so a healthcare conglomerate with a large presence in California, actually donated millions of dollars. But the key is they weren't building parks, but they were donating to groups that were involved with the stewardship of parks, right? And so I think that's a potential resource we can look at, is knowing that parks and open space are an essential healthcare, healthcare infrastructure, right? Can we invest actual health dollars in them as well, at the same time empowering communities?
I think it's Matthew, I'm glad you brought up the issue of infrastructure. In Los Angeles, we had a history in the 1950s and 60s of basically running the freeways, if necessary. If a park was in the way, you just cut the park in half in some way. So we have 5 critical parks that are cut in half, literally. The next question, and something that I'd like to take advantage of in terms of this, in the 2020 emergency situation, which we can really take advantage of and catapult into another level, is how many of the streets are going to be necessary? Can we narrow streets, and how could we use these streets? We've had a dream with some people in the office, Margot Jacobs and others. We looked at Wilshire Boulevard and thought, oh my goodness, Wilshire could be half the width, and just imagine the numbers of trees we could plant. So thinking of these urban forests that, I'm glad you brought up Kaiser, because we've noticed that too, is the healing forests in Japan. for example. Parks don't have to be that big. They just have to give people access to these spaces. And you can start looking at ways that some doctors in Japan send you to heal and do work in the forest by spending time there over a period of time before they start giving you medication. Come back 2 or 3 times, and once you're rested and can talk more about your experience and have walked a lot, then maybe that whatever it is that your symptoms are may have been controlled more. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in a lot of found space in our cities. Some of the roads are redundant, some are too wide, and we have new technology for transportation. And so that's something that we need to take advantage of.
One of the reasons we all, especially in Los Angeles, are going after what you just called the found spaces, the infrastructure, the streets, et cetera, is that larger urbanist legacy of our mid-century, what Christopher Hawthorne calls the second LA, was really about those freeways, single-family homes. The role of open space then was predominantly, your backyard, that mid-century American dream of taking your leisure in your private space. And now, as we're, hopefully on the cusp of this third LA, where we're encouraging denser, smart growth, access to transit, close to jobs and amenities, et cetera, I living in LA, I've never had a backyard. And I think future generations are going to have even less of that personal space. And so we're even more dependent on the public space that's around us in order to take our leisure, to have all those benefits that Sarah described about, what people are seeking when they go outside. And now we have to do it together. So we have to do it in common. Now it's a social thing. Now it can address some of those issues that Matthew raised. There's a panel coming up with Westside Urban Forum in a week or two about combating loneliness, right? So we have all these crises that are, we need that superfood of parks and open space more than ever. But because we have this legacy of, we're still living with second LA infrastructure, we've got to repurpose things that maybe, Olmsted, when he was laying out, the Back Bay or Buffalo or, all of these amazing park systems, we don't have that luxury now. We've got to seek those opportunities in new ways.
Yeah, so just to add on that, having also worked on the history, what we do have to be aware of too is that Central Park was built on the grounds of Seneca Village, which was an African American neighborhood, which was raised, to build those great parks. And so, I hope, I love Olmsted. I think he's very relevant right now, but let's also think about how we can improve it. And I think, right now it's an exciting time. We see a lot of possibilities and, especially in streets, but something I think we also have to be aware of in the future is we're just at the beginning of this pandemic, unfortunately. And we have to keep in mind that the CDC actually recommended that people drive to work instead of taking public transportation. And so I think this is going to be a very real challenge, in maybe 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, a year, as people start to return to where they're going, that, these streets may be unused now, but it's something we're probably going to have to fight for in the future.
Okay.
Yeah,
great.
I think.
Mm-hmm. Please go on.
No. I was just going to add a little bit to what Nate was saying and what Sarah just said about maybe the approach definitely is a sort of opportunistic accretional approach, and which is happening already. Sort of like instead of looking for these larger spaces, it's just adding into all the little tiny opportunities and excuses we have to form open space. So I love what Mia was saying about putting all the trees on the boulevard. That would be super awesome.
Okay, let's shift. Let's jump into some of the challenges that are facing the existence or the enjoyment of the use of public space, whether those challenges are due to gentrification, whether it's due to development, whether there are environmental challenges, civil unrest. I know there's a lot to unpack, but I want to give you guys a wide berth to discuss the myriad of challenges that are facing public space.
So I was going to, I know this is a lot to unpack. And of course, it is a lot to unpack, of course. It's been a very trying time for everybody, just trying to absorb and you know, appreciate the fact that we have the opportunity, in sort of a certain sense of obligation based on our skill sets to actually try to sort of address some of the issues of how do we convene, where do we convene, housing, homelessness, parks, etc. I was going to propose a solution here, and then I know other people are perhaps prepared. I get to speak about the challenges. I was going to propose that we think about, especially in the LA area where we have 88 cities and really at some point hundreds of villages where these issues are trying to be unpacked, and it's not a one size fits all in any way, that we think about an opportunity to basically have people be able to get together and try to understand the issues and try to help solve issues through community conservation corps. To do something that was done in the 60s, which was planning design centers, where the AIA would have a representative, where others would have a representative, in areas of the city where people are feeling that greenification or building a park or building housing are really driving them out of the area and leaving them sort of in dire straits, to make sure that these planning design centers become a place where you can go get information, understand better, talk to experts, and understand issues like, for example, how do you thrive in a place? What does it mean to actually work with community development banks that actually can be helpful to you? Things, you know, we've talked in our office quite a bit about the whole issue of economic sort of knowledge, like understanding. How do you know, what are your opportunities? And so these planning design centers, along with these community conservation corps, and then resiliency hubs. In New Orleans and a few other cities right after the big events that have happened there, and I think this is a mega event right now that we're all facing, resilience, we got some tours of the resiliency hubs, which are really interesting places. They're part of a school. They're strategically placed throughout a city or throughout a county in our case, and they become the place you go to when something like this hits. So conservation corps, planning design centers, and resiliency hubs, and hopefully the community can engage in a meaningful way to try to solve problems with the experts and professionals.
I would say, and I love the core idea, and I've been thinking, we were thinking about that same thing. And in context to the question about challenge, I think it's important to recognize that in this moment, public space has never been more valued. It's also never been more threatened at the same time. And we're at a very tenuous point in our history, both in general, of course, but also in context of this conversation. And we are going to need to marry big ideas with small actions and do so pretty aggressively. I think it's important to recognize that the Great American Outdoor Act was just permanently reauthorized, which is going to put together billions and billions of dollars away from oil companies and into public lands, including in urban America too. It's not a panacea, obviously, for a lot of issues, but it's one of the only pieces of bipartisan legislation that has happened in this administration. And it shows that there actually is interest in doing that. And I think it's up to us to propose ideas like Mia was talking about, to say, this is a big idea. It can employ people. It is part of our civic infrastructure. It can accelerate democracy. It can fight climate change. It is truly that multi-benefit opportunity. But until we articulate that and advocate that at every level of government and within our communities, it's not going to happen. So again, the challenges are manifold and many, but those are also opportunities as well. Every one of those challenges is an opportunity to articulate a solution.
Thank you, Matthew.
I'll share just a really obvious thing that we're seeing in our practice, and it's that municipal budgets are being slashed. They're dealing with a pandemic. And so at the same time that everything you guys said, we need it more than ever, is true, investment in parks and open space is being treated not as an essential, but as a luxury that cities can't afford. And so significant improvements, even some that were in construction, have been put on hold or canceled. And so, there's a, where does that, I loved the phrase you just said, big ideas, small actions. Maybe the big projects we've all, primarily worked on won't be the way that we dig ourselves out of this. And it will be, whether it's conservation corps or, smaller, closer to home, more volunteerism. There's going to have to be a different toolbox than traditional municipal, we're going to pass a parks bond and, invest in 3 or 4 major projects around the city, because those are being reined in right now. And I don't see that changing for a few years after this.
Yeah, I think the potential to think about open space as sort of, smaller network spaces, which would also probably, I was thinking about public space pre-pandemic. There was sort of a troubling trend towards public space being very much driven towards privatization and capitalization, like whether it was businesses who are, giving open space, but in return for height waivers, but they still sort of oversee it, or it's a public space that's mostly driven by retail. And again, as I showed, these showpiece public spaces, which are wonderful. Like there's some really great designs out there. But if we again, I also love that phrase that Matthew uses. These are big ideas, so let's think on a small level, because that will also distribute these spaces throughout communities that need them. And so we don't need Central Park again, but maybe we need Central Park that's broken up into 150 lots, right, and distributed and networked across the city. And for me, I think that's really exciting to think about.
I hope it's both, but
yeah. Big parks are good too. But yeah. So
Matthew, you mentioned threats. We've been talking about challenges, and challenges to me may be unintentional obstacles. Threats are a little more intentional, and Nate mentioned that budgets are being slashed. So I think that's potentially a challenge and a threat. Can you unpack just maybe for a few minutes what some of the real threats are, which are intentional things that are being done to potentially limit the use or the development of public space?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of them have been mentioned. Nate talked about municipal budgets that have been slashed. That is true, and that is a fight we're going to have to fight. In New York, this year I think $45 million have been cut in the parks budget. Sarah mentioned privatization and who controls public space, whether that's a developer or private entities, or even bids sometimes. And what does that mean for access? I like to always think about threats as opportunities, because otherwise we're going to be, in a mire. And so I would say, yes, we do need to fight for parks budgets, but we also need to be advocating for other ways to invest. Now, actually go back to that public health conversation, just recognize that there are trillions of dollars in public health spending across this country, and insurers, cities, hospitals are recognizing increasingly that community health is how you save money, right? We are all, a lot of architects and designers, and we can think abstractly and conceptually. People in health think concretely and based on evidence and bottom lines, but they're realizing that parks are actually a smart investment. So whether that's through, health impact assessments that can show impact, or Community Reinvestment Act opportunities, there are some funding streams out there that I think could not only bridge that gap, but even at multiple scales start to invest in parks and parks infrastructure. So I think that spending is one, but ultimately it's about advocacy. Like, the reason those budgets are being cut is because we need to be advocates for what this work means.
Yes. So I totally agree with you, and I think it would be interesting to figure out how we could all advocate together. I think that there is also private funding out there. I think in California, we're seeing social impact funding on the part of some sort of donors who are starting to look at, well, if I take 10, 20% of my wealth and I do something, what are some of the things I could choose to do? So it's about presenting these opportunities to the right people. So private, foundations and others are prepared to participate, I think. Actually, I don't think, I know. So
I'll put in a plug for Mia and I are both board emeriti with the Landscape Architecture Foundation, and they've teamed up with a whole bunch of other organizations around the country and are proposing what's called the Green New Deal Super Studio. And it's going to be regionally based collections of people like everyone on this call getting together and working out physical projects and plans and policies to implement the Green New Deal, hopefully in a new administration. So keep an eye out, or you can just Google GND Super Studio, and everyone will be welcome to participate in that and move some of these issues forward.
Okay, we're going to go to, I'm sorry.
Just quickly, I think it's actually an important point to mention the role of philanthropy and wealth in parks creation. And if you look around the country, the number of new parks that have been created by the largesse of, high net worth individuals or philanthropy, I think there's an important balance to be had there. As we think about what the role of the public is in investing and not shirking that role. I would point to there's a consortium of foundations that have invested in what's called Civic Commons, which I'm sure many of you know of, which is a kind of not only investing in projects, but in an idea of what civic commons and public space can mean. So I think there needs to be a kind of important balance that they can't be the kind of panacea, but they are an important player, but they need to be, a player on a broader team, I think.
Excellent, excellent. Well, since everyone on the panel is solutions focused, and we have a lot of big ideas represented on the panel, let's move into and let's close out with the future of public space, and let's suggest any of your big ideas and any of your solutions. We'll be able to do that for the next 16 or 17 minutes.
All right, I'll start with one. I am seeing during this crisis a certain liberalization of the way we use public space. We talked about it with streets. We're definitely seeing it with alcohol as well. And I'm hopeful that Americans will overcome a certain prudishness about what's appropriate in a park or in public space, when it's appropriate to be in one. I put my background here is actually a memory from last summer. After 20 years of promises, I finally took the family to Italy for the grand tour, and it was 108 degrees in Rome by the time we got to Rome. And our favorite thing to do after a day of dragging them all through the gardens was to go to the Tiber River, and they had this wonderful night market. It's strung along a bike trail for over a mile. I thought, man, why can't we have this on the LA River, right? And another example, my wife is from Brazil. I've spent a wonderful night out in Sao Paulo with Mia. Alma actually spent a night out with Walter there as well. And when you go to the beach in Brazil, you can sit down and someone will bring you a cold beer. You can get a skewer of shrimp, just like this. And I come back to LA and they're criminalizing street vendors, or if you get up early in China and you go to a park and there's fitness groups one after another lined up. And then I moved to Santa Monica and they outlawed trainers from having group classes in the most popular parks. And I just thought, wow, we are so uptight. And so my one hope, one silver lining of all this is that some of the bending of the rules that we're seeing happening in our public spaces right now to accommodate this crisis will also crack open the door to, just using it at different times of day. Our cities are getting hotter. Why aren't we out in them at night? And so many other ways. I think there's a concern about privatization and commercialization if you allow these vendors and so forth to happen in our parks. But honestly, more people will come and more people will enjoy them, and you'll feel safer in some of those found places that Alma and Mia were talking about if we have that vibrancy. So I hope we loosen up a little after COVID.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I was going to say that the uptightness, as you were defining it, it is a mixture, and that's probably one of the hardest things to change, but it is a mixture of what authorities actually define as, the public welfare, and what we as the public allowed to take that definition at heart and say, yeah, that's unsafe for me, so I will say unsafe for my family. And I think this is the reason why earlier in the conversation I was saying this is not the only issue, but it's one of those intrinsic things that has many tentacles that translates into many things. And a lot of the decisions tend to be made for the welfare of people. And that's my profession is I am in charge of putting the welfare of communities at the forefront. Any decision in theory that I'm making in terms of design for public space or any other type of open space is first think about the welfare. And the problem with that is that it is true what I have to do, but also we then tend to be like overbearing parents in which we are protecting, you know, everybody a little bit too much. And I think maybe as was mentioned earlier, this is a time to begin to have that conversation among all the other ones that we just listed, right? It is about just asking ourselves what is risk and what is safe and what is not safe in all these different contexts. And each condition is different. It's impossible to generalize. And definitely our agencies and our professionals are in charge of making sure that we don't put people in harm's way. But on the other hand, I don't know what is the mechanism, but I would love to see how we have that conversation in a lot of the community meetings and you know, public outreach efforts that we make for projects. The assumption that safety is a given, is a solid answer, is you shall protect in this manner against, you know, potentially challenging infrastructure that may not be compatible with your desires, or having some activities allowed in public spaces that may be harmful. And I think having that flexibility is what we probably need to make sure that somehow becomes part of the way that we code things in the future. And I think, again, I don't have the solution. This is my dream in a way. It's like, how can we make flexible code in a sense that is not necessarily to make people or things worse, but rather to allow for these unexpected, this particular conditions that we all live in, that the generalized sort of overarching fixed code prevents us from trying inventiveness, trying different ways to engage. I think Sarah had mentioned before, sort of, we worked a lot in sort of brown and Black communities, and sometimes, and this is not trying to romanticize my Mexicanness here in any manner, but I do know, because I grew up in Mexico, that people take open space and use it in a lot of different ways, less concerned about safety, and that causes a lot of issues. I understand there's a whole other discussion to be had. But the only difference that I see between my two countries, which is where I navigate now in between, is that because there's a little bit less fixed regulation in Mexico, for example, people then tend to be more opportunistic about how they satisfy their need for open space. And I'm not saying that that's what we should do in the US and sort of let everybody sort of loose and go and do whatever they want. But I don't know, if we're very clever as humans to invent new things. So I think there are new challenges. How do we invent flexible, elastic code, if I may, to try to figure out how that adapts to specific conditions for the benefit of more, not the detriment of more.
So I appreciate to sort of support some of what you're saying. What we have to realize is that some of the neighborhoods that we actually should sort of be thinking about are the ones that don't have any parks and they don't have improvements, and that we have to help give these people agency, and we have to help support them. So for every, so parks have to be built in those areas. And, working in Los Angeles, where you have, sometimes you're working with immigrants from one part of the world and immigrants from another part of the world, but you also have the local community that has not been given the right or access to parks in their neighborhoods. So how do we do that, and how do we actually make it sort of reflect their sort of dreams and aspirations, and have them feel comfortable using those places? And where's that funding coming from, and how do we make that happen sooner than later?
I would articulate for the future of public space actually has nothing to do with public space. It is all about people. That would be my dream, is that public space is really about people. one of my favorite examples is actually an LA1 Parks After Dark, which is a kind of a simple idea of a collaboration that started as a way to prevent violent crime, but really came to be as a way to drive partnership among cities and community partners and people and activating parks in the summertime. And when you read about that work, as a designer myself, it wasn't about the design of the park. It was actually about people coming together and working and using parks as a platform for X or Y, or whatever that community wanted to see happen. I think the real crisis of climate change has not been that a lack of solutions, and parks are a great solution. It's been not putting people in service of that solution, or making them aware of that solution, or contextualizing it within their life. And I think parks can, this goes back to my point about health, it's about people connecting to each other and with place. And if we can focus on people first and then parks second, I think there's a real opportunity to make change.
Yeah, I think design comes in hand with a lot of societal changes, hopefully for the positive that we see in upcoming years. And it may really just hit it on the head right away, talking about liberalization. So I was a resident of New Orleans for 9 years, which is sort of the most European city in the United States, and is very liberal about its public space and alcohol in the streets. And I lived there, during Hurricane Katrina, so saw public space dramatically contract and expand in the years afterwards. But I think something we have to keep in mind is, and again with this idea about liberalization, that also hits on a lot of the issues that we're thinking about today. And we have to remember that the protests that we're seeing right now are in part come from how Black and Brown people are policed in public space. And so this idea about rules and regulations has a direct relationship to the protests we see right now. And so we should definitely not be making more rules around our public space. We see even in the Emerald Necklace here in Boston, we have the 6-foot distancing everywhere. That should not be an excuse to arrest people or ticket them or put them into financial debt. And so I think design is related to all of these things. And design was in part implicit in some of the septet rules of the mid-century, right? And so this profession has been complicit in some of this policing and injustice. So again, something to be aware about. But a lot of it, again, though, is not about design, but we have to think about design hand in hand with societal changes, with civil changes, and with administrative changes.
I'm really glad you brought that up, Sarah. Will shared some articles with us as we were preparing for this, and one of them was about some Black and Brown communities feeling like, oh great, all the urbanists are doing their parklets and everything again, but what about all of our deeper needs that we have and have been expressing for a long time and feeling like they've been neglected, but now you guys want to have outdoor dining and you change a rule like that. And I just wanted to share an experience that I'm having right now. We're located in Leimert Park, a historically Black neighborhood. And during COVID, we've been working with some of the neighborhood businesses in our commercial district and talking with them about, okay, so what would you like to see here? And they're raising things that they have been bringing up for decades. But they're also very opportunistic and they don't want to miss the chance. They say, all right, sign us up for the alfresco program, but we're not going to stop there. We want our 3rd Street promenade, so it isn't an either or. We don't have to dunk on the urbanist stuff in order to honor the longer term commitments that have been neglected for too long. We can leverage these quick wins and do it, as some of you guys mentioned, in places that haven't been seeing, the hip tactical urban solutions, give them those tools, help co-create with them so that they change the ground, move the ground, so they expand the constituency to hopefully make those long-term changes. So the tactical and the deeper needs really are partners, and we don't have to choose between them.
So Kevin, not to, so here I am putting it back a little bit on you, but I think that as you could see on the panel, and although some of us are Latinas, sort of the representation on the part of sort of the Black and Brown community and in these forums is tough. It's tough to get, meaning that there is not as many people who've gone through the design education, and you know, that's something that we're going to have to create that pipeline and work through it so that in this generation we can, you know, have that engagement. So I just was wondering, sort of, you know, if you have some, you know, some thoughts around how to get those voices out, and maybe they're not designers, maybe there are, as part of the Conservation Corps, groups of people who are trained as you know, for outreach and conservation, and that participate meaningfully in these design conversations. Because everybody has design ideas or thoughts about what their community could look like, or how you could improve something, or how you could make your school into a park also. So what are, you know, just throwing it out there, and a little bit of NOMA stuff to share with us.
That's a great plug for NOMA. Thank you. You know, I mean, obviously it's not the design of public space, even though as an architect, we've impacted it. I think that we have probably neglected it to a degree where at times it's the leftover space for us. And that's not fair, but because we're so focused on the built environment, we tend to almost forget about the design, the well design of the outdoor space. But I think NOMA is a start because we don't have as many planners and landscape architects who are members, who I think would be great members and could begin to add to the discussion. We talk about community, we talk about the public use of space, but not in the same way that you would. And you and everyone on the panel would bring a perspective to the majority architect-led organization that is so richly needed. So what I would say is, in the very immediate future, let's have that conversation with NOMA, and let's introduce a public space roundtable within that group, and then we take it on the road.
So Kevin, just coincidentally, I'm actually getting on a call with our student chapter of NOMAS right after this panel. And it's been, and so we're actually having it in conjunction with AIAS, and something we found is that they felt that their voices were suppressed a little bit because AIAS, they thought had, I don't know, there was a hierarchy set up where they thought that AIAS had more of a voice or more of a direct line to our chair, and so we've started putting them together in the meetings, and especially listening to what NOMAS wants. But you know, as an educator, I'll take on some of this heat too, because that is the pipeline. But what I try and stress to you know, our local professional organizations is the pipeline doesn't stop at the school, but we have to think about support for these students once they get into the profession as well, and that's really crucial. So it's just more conversation, I think, between educators and practitioners, as hopefully we're having today, is really crucial for elevating those voices.
That's right. Okay. Well, if there is nothing else, it is 9 o'clock, and I know that we want to move into our question and answer period. So, Will?
Yeah, thank you, Kevin, and everyone, thank you for joining us today. If you have questions, please either put them into the chat feature, or under the participants button, you can see you can toggle the raise your hand feature, so we'll go that way. The first question was from Isabel. Isabel, are you here? Do you want to ask your question directly about the biodiversity report, Ecotops? And then after Isabel, we'll hear from Emily Fielding. Go ahead, Isabel.
I just wanted to mention that the City of LA just released their 2020 version of the Biodiversity Report, which is based on the Singapore Index. It splits Los Angeles up into a variety of ecotopes based on microclimates and habitat types. I think there are about 15 ecotopes. You may or may not be familiar with it. So really, I just wanted to let you know about it and to look out for it because it's really very exciting. It came out of the Bureau of Sanitation. But really my question here is, as we see our city densifying and needing more housing, we're seeing a lot of conflict between open space and housing. And I'm wondering how do you designers, landscape architects, and architects, how do you see us able to bridge the gap? How can we use infrastructure and even building design and create habitat within those areas? Mia spoke to that a little bit when she talked about closing down Wilshire Boulevard. I'm thinking, you know, we kind of need a revolution in that way where we actually start designing buildings to actually be habitats. And so I was just hoping you could comment on that. Thank you.
So buildings as habitats it is one of the questions, yes? Or one of, I mean, there are a number of sort of projects going on in the city where, you know, the sort of collaboration with architects that are really intrigued by Los Angeles, the weather, and the opportunity of actually, and it requires also the appetite of the developers and the funders to actually do terraces and basically common spaces at multiple levels. And I think that's happening quite a bit in a series of projects that we're working on. So we're following basically the Rio guidelines, which are the City of Los Angeles' guidelines for projects in an area along the river. So I think you're going to find that there's a lot of interest, and the planning department is very supportive also in getting those projects underway. And I think it goes along with the idea everybody was talking about here is that doing more rather than less parks, doing a lot of smaller parks wherever and opportunistically you can do them, and actually to plant millions of trees and to create, you know, make this the sponge city that many people have been advocating for.
Put in a plug for our pollinator team at Rios. If you go to rios.com, invisible infrastructure, Jason Shinoda, one of our great landscape architects, and his team have been doing a great deal of research on putting back pollinator habitat in Los Angeles. And we did a mapping of the entire Expo line corridor and realized that our warehouse and that immediate vicinity was one of the greatest deserts along that corridor in terms of like stepping stones for birds and butterflies and bees and everybody to make their way through Los Angeles. And so that's been a really important topic in our work. We do a lot of mixed use development where there isn't as much space on the ground, but there are different elevations, and really trying to incorporate all of our natural wildlife opportunities into that development as well. And I'll just say regionally, because these things, there's a push and a shove sometimes between housing and habitat. And I don't want to lose track of the regional priority of encouraging people to live close together, because, you know, yes, a single family neighborhood may have lots of green in it, but if we housed all of Los Angeles that way, we'd reach all the way to Nevada. And so imagine, we have to see the broader, you know, regional impact of the way that we live. And you can imagine the climate impacts of everybody using as much greenhouse gases as it would take to get around and live our lives that way. So sometimes you have to make trade-offs, and there might be at an immediate micro site scale, not as much habitat, but if we're making those decisions smartly, we're pulling the people together and making room for those parks Mia is describing nearby as part of a smart growth strategy. So there are trade-offs, and we have to kind of integrate those goals.
Kevin, we had a question from Denise about the integration of public space and streets and the design process. Denise, are you on the call? Do you want to ask your question directly? She might be on mute.
Mm-hmm.
So the next question then will go to Karen Feinberg. You pointed out quite a bit, Karen. Would you like to address the panel directly with your questions?
Hi, everyone.
We'd love to see your faces.
Hi, everyone. My webcam is not so great, thus you see a pic of a pic. Hi, I've been very active as of late with the AIA LA. I'm talking to you from New Jersey. No questions, just most inspired by the thoughts and this community. It's helping me deeply think about a layer connected to my own work about systems change and innovations. So I submitted a lot. I always submit a lot in the chats, it seems. No questions exactly, but I do think I had the opportunity to attend virtually, since some of my background is tied to youth and next generations. I had the opportunity to attend the virtual SOMA SoCal camp this weekend. It was phenomenal, and that community is growing, it seems. So that would be an important partnership, I think, to engage in these sets of issues. And I did have the opportunity in Boston, where I was located for 15 years. I'm from Minneapolis originally, to participate in a very large workshop with young people, mostly underserved communities, to envision parks and open spaces. And a lot of these young people were from underserved communities. There was somebody I met who was 3 blocks away from the ocean who had never seen it before, which is wild. And I think that's more common than perhaps we realize. Well, maybe not in LA. But we gave them all kinds of art supplies to invent and map out, just create with form their idea of public spaces and parks. And it was, we put a hip hop studio in the park that turned into a place for food innovations. So that, so there could be all kinds of really creative ways to engage public spaces, and also economic development for young people, to be really creative about how we engage them, and not just youth.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Karen. That's a great remark. Anyone want to comment on that?
Yeah, so right behind me here is Vista Hermosa Park, which is a park that was built with a state agency, the Santa Mountain Conservancy. And the idea is to bring nature to the city. It was it was 10 years ago, and conceptually a window to the mountains. And in that park now, there is graduations, quinceañeras, weddings, but more than anything, it's a 10-acre basically chaparral and very nature setting that is doing extremely well. And from there, there's programs that take the through the Rangers program from the Conservation Corps and the Conservancy, that take the families out to the mountains and to the beaches. So it's of course, everything right now is not operational, unfortunately, because of COVID-19, and it's kind of tough. But it became a haven for folks. And even though in the initial community meetings, I was warned by a parent that there were 3 gangs in the neighborhood, and that we had, what were we going to do to plan for them? We just pushed ahead and said, well, let them come. We invited them. They helped plant trees, and there has never been an incident of any sort in that park. It did help that coyotes showed up, because they liked the new nature space in the middle of the city. So with that, I'd say that would be my comment. lot of great things going on. Hi, Stephanie.
Thank you, Mia. Emily Fielding asked a question that I think, she's not here anymore, but I think her question's worth answering again. And it's really about, and this is a balance that I think all of you could address, the investment in parks that kind of goes hand in hand with, the fear of gentrification or displacement. And you all touched on that earlier, but I'm wondering if you have a strategy for how you deal with that.
I like to take that one because it's something I think a lot about, care a lot about. And it's something I heard, I work more in New York now, but I've worked nationally. And I kept hearing this around the country, which is, I actually don't want this park because I'm fear of the change it's going to bring. And you could say the same thing for grocery store or other asset. And it's one of the real shames of our country is that certain communities fear healthy food and access to green space because of the dynamics of gentrification or whatnot. It's an absolute, shame on us for having that situation. And I think there's no magic bullet here. There of course, policy broadly defined is critical, but I would point to an example. One of my favorite examples is in Harlem, New York. There was a Whole Foods being constructed, and there was a fear of displacement, gentrification, and I'm not advocating for this Whole Food necessarily, but what happened, Harlem had a really strong social infrastructure. They had people who were connected, and they advocated on behalf of small business owners, and particularly the small food producers in the Harlem area, to say, if you want this Whole Foods here, you have to buy our products. And now there are 1,000 small businesses that supply that grocery store. I'm not saying that's the solution, but what that points to is that strong communities that have connectivity, cohesion, social capital, and can use that to advocate for themselves, then can also advocate for affordable housing or for what kind of public space comes in and how they can be connected to it. It's that long-term, and I mentioned this back in the kind of public health comment, by building that first and as well, that's long-term change that can help prevent a community that doesn't have power, whether that's in front of city council or vice versa. That's to me is the solution that is most, I think, impactful.
We can't take the benefits of parks and everything outside of the context of the economics of housing in our cities. If you make a place nicer and attract more people to it, and you don't have more houses for those people, the prices are going to go up. The rents are going to go up. The sale value of homes are going to go up. So I'm an unabashed YIMBY about this, but, and being in Leimert Park, for example, I have that conversation with the business owners. Are we the gentrifiers, all these row of design firms? Or, Mia, you probably had this conversation with your colleagues in Boyle Heights, and it's, we're all part of change, but if you put a cap on the housing at the same time, that we don't want keep it shitty to be the only way to keep prices down. We need to be able to improve communities to serve everyone and at the same time make room for everybody. So we need lots more housing that goes along with the belt lines and the high lines and the all these parks and other improvements, whether it's Whole Foods or one of the first neighborhoods I lived in after grad school, people mobilized against a library branch. I thought, is the solution to not read? Because of that very fear. And, I think we really have to put housing in the mix with any of these other conversations and make sure we're creating enough housing to absorb all the people who want to be a part of these great communities we're building.
I think there has to be a planning, institutionalized strategy where if you're going to build housing, that you also help contribute towards parks. And New York is, very experienced at that, and we need to start. There is some kind of a social benefit or environmental benefit tax associated with putting, 1,000, 300-400 families into a space that is tight. So in the sense that it's been hard to look at P2s and P3s in LA or EFIDs, we need to start thinking that way. So it's not quite happening at this point. We have Quimby funds that get generated. And sometimes, that is very helpful, but I think the direct relationship of what you build and the benefits to the community beyond the private, the families living in those communities has to be sort of thought through.
Yeah, I forgot I had, I had bookmarked an article specifically for this conversation. There was a paper that came out, I think it was earlier this year, called Green Gentrification, or Just Green Enough, that was looking at, and I'll share the title in the chat in a moment. It was done by Alessandro Rigolone and Jeremy Nemeth. And they were looking at 10 cities and looking at if park location, size, or function had the strongest correlation with gentrification. And what they found is they actually couldn't find a correlation with size, but they did find a function, and that is that parks that emphasize active transportation, so say bike lanes, was actually the largest predictor of gentrification. Now, this just green enough discourse has been at least in academic circles for a while, and unfortunately I think it's been twisted to mean that these communities don't need high design, and that should not be the case at all. These communities need design, but the link with active transportation, I think, just speaks to we need to ask what they want and what they need, and a lot of communities want basic maintenance, right, is very key, safety, and activities that are more related to what the people there do. And of course, the hood design has been where Alma has been really revolutionary in thinking about community engagement and how that forms design. But on the flip side, we can look at a case like the Atlanta Beltline, which has been pointed to as a very strong correlate with gentrification along that corridor. So this is not to say Black and brown communities don't need bike lanes, or they don't need a place for active transportation or active recreation, but just that functions and the amenities that we put in parks and open space does speak to or gives a message of who we think belongs there or not. So I'll share the title and the researchers in the chat, so hopefully people can look it up.
Thank you, Sarah. So Stephanie Reich has a question here that she just wanted me to read into the chat, and it really deals with innovative strategies for reaching consensus, especially with regards to the inherent disconnection between sometimes with your community outreach, the most vocal happen to be the most self-entitled, or protecting their own self-interest. And so what are your thoughts as a panel on reaching consensus, and especially including those voices that might not have the time to come to your community outreach opportunities?
I can take the first stab at that, and I hope other people can add into that. We find that circumstance a lot in our projects, definitely, precisely for the reasons that the question mentions, is the people who are more entitled, they have more privilege, they are more vocal, and they actually are fighting for their own needs. So yeah, we talk about that a lot and try to come up with different methods and ways to sort of invite other community members to participate and to get those voices heard. But a lot of times it ends up being a hybrid between what you literally have to hear from individuals and what you can do through research and just understanding the history of a place. So we mix a little bit that, and we use our own voices to speak from some of the voices, because we can't force people to attend all the meetings, and people don't have the luxury to attend many meetings that end up happening all the time. So we've been working actually in the studio with a lot of different methods. There's a new organization that we started trying to pair with, it's called Streetwise. It's almost like a way to collect feedback through just an app, and so we expand the reach to other people that cannot sort of do the traditional public participation process. And but again, I think it's from my point of view, it's a little bit an easy solution to say, I go to my meetings, I organize them, I check my list, and I talk to the community 3 times. This is what they told me, this is what we do. I think what we do in the studio a lot of times is try to interpret how the other voices can filter through that. And even if I don't get the comment straight directly from somebody, again, through spending the time understanding the community and the history and doing the research, we can add those voices to a level to sort of continue to hope to make sure that the conversation is broader.
So I would say that is amazing that you're able to do that. And you know, it comes from also the DNA of your studio, and I appreciate that. There is, in the post-COVID world, there is a lot of people getting online for community meetings, much more than we
Definitely.
ever, yeah, we ever would have expected. I would have, in the group, in the meetings, in the projects we've been working on, we've been working with organizations, local organizations to certain communities like Mujeres de la Tierra or Lata Spot and others. And that their strategies actually to go to people and to communities, and then to also inspire them to participate as representatives. And so they become also, some of them are so sophisticated that by the second or third year, they get themselves elected to the neighborhood council, which is kind of a much more status quo. And so you all of a sudden have all these people that are engaged, that are, it's really rich. And I find it, you know, so when you have the actual design communities meetings, so to speak, you know, they're vocal, and it's about education. That's why our firm always talks about advocacy by design, meaning as we design, we help them understand that we have to make financial decisions, we have to make environmental decisions, we have to, you know, and that things take a long time. And it's just fascinating, though, to me, how some of these young, these families that for him, Mujeres de la Tierra, that got organized, when I wanted to know how they got 5,000 people to a community, you know, sort of meeting, online, it was the teenagers that were helping make that happen.
Right.
So
no, I see.
Uh-huh.
I couldn't agree more. I think this is another one of those weird sort of silver linings of this situation, in which the fact that we are demystifying the notion of sort of this remote meeting, I'm hoping that it will allow many other communities to join a lot easier. And you're totally right. It is with the youth. We are, and I still think that there's a lot of the way, kind of the way that we present some of the facts in this meetings, and how we invite the responses also has a lot of influence. And we have to recognize as designers, the way that I present the facts for people to react to or respond to have a lot of power into how they react, and so forth. We're actually working right now on a couple of projects in East Palo Alto, which is very different than Palo Alto, where Stanford is. It's actually a traditionally or historically Black community. That what is interesting right now in the projects that we're finding is that we have done or try to educate ourselves a lot in what was that legacy, what happened in that community. Has been a victim of institutional racism for so long is kind of appalling. But what is happening right now is, in many places in California and in the US in general, is that there's an influx of other communities. So right now, East Palo Alto has a lot of Latinos coming in, as in many other places. And the interesting dynamic is that we're finding that even from the point of view of the sort of families that live in East Palo Alto that were Black, they're seeing even the Latinos are now the new gentrifiers. They're coming to take our. So this is bizarre sort of dialogue. And what we've been trying to do is sort of try to connect to what was those, what is that legacy from, what does it mean that you were a community of color, and what does it mean now that you will welcome other people? And I think there's been some interesting conversations to be had, and not all of them actually translate specifically to design. I mean, there's more to be discussed, and I think I am actually excited to see how we even improve the way our sort of virtual tools work to be able to get that conversation a little bit more free. Right now, our tools, from my point of view, remain a little bit rudimentary. And so we are seeing more sophistication happening there. But yeah, it's an opportunity and a new challenge for all of us, I think.
I met Kevin when we first started working on Destination Crenshaw, which is a linear museum, 2 miles long at this point, on Crenshaw Boulevard, starting at Leimert Park and ending up at Obama Triangle Square. That project, you know, had a lot of really interesting sort of under a tent events. They were incredibly well attended, and it was part of it, sort of the initial, you know, the initial stages of sort of really doing videos and then having people go and have different experiences, and really the people felt heard. And food matters, how much food you serve in these events, and and childcare matters. So between those two and just listening, I think that was a really, I think people have felt heard. And at some point then, from a design perspective, they let go, you know, and along the river where there's been communities where there's a lot of pollution and sort of really horrible state of some of the industrial sites, people just could not believe that anybody would ever clean it for them. You would clean it for white people, fancy people. You won't clean it for us. Yeah. And so there's been some bad experiences. So we actually put them in a bus, and we went and looked at some properties that had been gone through remediation and had become parks, including a park that Albion Park that the city just completed along the river. So it was really, you know, a very, it was, again, these are these people that have gotten organized in the same area and were now part of the neighborhood council. And so I just can speak to, I think one of you, Matthew, and some of you were talking about how important it is to have the leadership in these communities and in these neighborhoods, sort of get all the tools they need to actually participate meaningfully.
So we're almost go ahead. We're almost out of time, but I wanted to just cue everyone up for closing remarks. But before we do that, we have a question from John Lesak, who wrote a great op-ed and architect about the Great Outdoors Act. But it was really about the balance between public access and security. And so while you're, especially with schoolyards, and so if some of you could comment on that, but as you do, then I'm going to cue up Ziba, who has her hand raised and she's patiently waiting. So if the panel could respond first to the balance between public access and security, especially with regards to parks and open space. And then Ziba, we'll put you on, and then Kevin will have you kind of coordinate the final round of closing remarks.
Okay.
I'll just reiterate what Alma said earlier about, maybe we need to take some risks, and they can be smart risks. Anyone who's a parent knows that you're always it's a balancing act, and you're always kind of pushing your kids to be, leaning into those boundaries. And I think remember who remembers adventure playgrounds? We can't do that now because we're so worried about what might happen. And I think all of the ways that we think about our public space, if we're willing to recognize that there are much bigger benefits to taking those risks, if we can communicate about those articulately, if we can find the data to support the public health, the economic development, the equity, things that will come along with loosening up, as I called it earlier, I would sort of leave you with that. This balance of security actually has really tremendous consequences. And if we can see past those risks, there's a lot of opportunity to use our parks and open space more robustly.
And Ziba, your question?
Hi, Ziba Gassemi. I'm with Westfield. And first of all, I just want to say how much I appreciate all the great ideas that is coming out of this conversation and this great panel. And Mia, I really like the idea of design community design center, and we definitely need to talk about that more, because I know some of us actually within the chapter were talking about how we can connect more to the communities and bring the profession and architecture to the community. A couple of things that pop up in my mind when we were talking about challenges and opportunities. One is that city guidelines, city standards, do you guys, when you actually come across those guidelines, see that as opportunity or challenges? Do you think they in any way need to be updated? What are your thoughts about that? And another thing is more of an idea that pops on my mind as we were talking about this, and this is just recently conversation that I had with my hairstylist. And, we were talking about her, profession and where it's going in the future and how their spaces are going to change. And she said that, no, there's this new trend and nobody's really thinking of going back to what they were doing before. In fact, with her and a number of people that she knows, they're looking for small sort of like living places, like an apartment, but with an outdoor space that they can live, but at the same time they provide a service that you have that outdoor space and you can provide a service. And that is actually a real trend that is happening within that industry. And I was thinking about sort of, how services and professions are really changing right now. And, we're talking about opportunities and challenges. And, what is your thought about these kind of trends? Thank you.
And yeah, thank you, Ziba. And as the panelists responds, maybe they can do that through their closing remarks. Kevin, I'm going to give it back to you to sort of manage the final few minutes here, because I know our time is limited.
Okay, very good. So if anyone can respond to Ziba's comment, that would be great. And I would ask everyone in your closing remarks to come away with that. Make your closing statement on that one big idea or that one concern that you really want this group to walk away with, so that everyone knows what's at the top of your list as we close out. Let's talk about what your one big, and I'm sorry that it's only one, but let's talk about what your one big idea or your one concern is as you address Ziba's comments.
So just to address what Ziba just said, I think maybe we're not thinking enough about enlisting business owners for the fight for public space. That's actually a really good, it's a really good point. I know in the past, in cities where I've lived, business owners have been very much against, say, bike lanes, right, or closing down streets, because they're worried that it's actually going to affect their business negatively. And this forced change that we've seen is maybe it shows that that it's actually good for business if you can have that adjacent outdoor space. And so let's think about how we can enlist them in preserving this open space that we have. As a closing remark, I would just say I just finished up a book where I looked at 150 years of different epidemics and urban landscape responses. And oddly, I finished the draft right before the pandemic hit, and so now I'm trying to get it back to revise the conclusion. But one thing that I learned is that the pandemic will pass, hopefully quickly, at least in the course of history, but we are still going to be left with the greatest challenges to health, which are climate change and social inequity. And the great thing is that parks and open space are crucial in combating all three. So let's think about how we do it more carefully, humanely, and expansively in the future.
All righty, thank you, Sarah. For everyone, Sarah Carr is a PhD. She's an assistant professor at Northeastern University. Matthew?
I'll just keep it brief and say the big opportunity right now is to be investing in people as well as public space together. I think we've seen what that means in this conversation. So I think that's something we're looking forward to working on. And I think it's a great focus and theme of this conversation too.
Thank you, Matthew. Matthew is the Executive Director of the Design Trust for Public Space. Mia.
So I totally agree that we have to work with people and think of parks. And I would put a plug in for my Community Conservation Corps and the Planning Design Centers, because I think in moving forward to give all these people that we really want to bring into onto the fold, we need to give them agency, and they need to be able to participate with our support.
Thank you. Mia, by the way, love your solutions on Destination Crenshaw. Everyone, Mia is the president of Studio MLA, and thank you for your time, Mia. Alma.
It's a team solution, Kevin, just not my solution, okay?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you.
The one thing on my mind right now, I don't know if it's a big idea, is an unsurmountable thought, but this notion of, and I think the last person asked the question about how those guidelines help or not help in certain things. I do think that as we get more and more sophisticated in an understanding of we have algorithms that tells me what kind of jeans I'm supposed to be buying. So I'm wondering if we can begin to think of how we look at code in the different urban settings as again, this sort of elastic way of determining some of the parameters that take into account the specific conditions of each location, which this is kind of what the designer does in theory, but we end up sometimes hitting a wall when we get to certain code that is completely inflexible. And I have a lot of examples of things that are somewhat arbitrary, that are dictated by larger picture thinking, that once you get to the micro scale, they begin to seem ridiculous. So I'm not against code, just to be clear, but I do think that there's an opportunity for all of us to start thinking that way, because as we notice in this panel, there are a lot of creative ideas, and the way we're going to dig ourselves out of these problems is with creative thinking, and we can't really then shoot ourselves in the foot by being blocked by some relentless guidelines that only look at a narrow point of view. And I think this is a much bigger thought, but it's what is stuck in my head after this conversation.
All righty. Alma, thank you for your time. Everyone, Alma is the studio director with Hood Design Studios in the Bay Area. And then Nate.
I'll just piggyback on what Alma said. I loved that word elasticity. I was going to say flexibility, what time we use parks, what we're doing there, what kind of businesses people can be launching to serve us and build their own opportunities in parks. All of those ways that we bend the rules. And I love this idea that it might actually be not just bending the rules for rule breaking sake, but actually customized to the opportunities that are present, whether they're physical assets or community assets. I think that's something I hope we all stretch as we come out of the COVID era. And I'll just put one last plug in for that Green New Deal Super Studio, which I think, Mia, would be a fantastic way to put together this conservation core. And if we build that design center, maybe it's its first project, but then it lives on and tackles the next issues.
Yes, we've been thinking about that. So yes.
All right, I'm in.
Excellent.
All righty. Thank you, Nate, for everyone. Nate is the studio director with Rio Studios here in Leimert Park in Los Angeles. So with that, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Chu and Gooding Architects. And Will, if we don't have anything else, I think we can say good day to everyone.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to unmute everyone and we'll do a round of applause. So thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you, Kevin. Great job. And join us again on August 16th for our 6th in this series on multifamily residential.